Cyberpunk should have come out in 2022. That's coming from one of the developers in a recent Bloomberg article. We're going to talk about that as well as Cyberpunk's apology that they gave out, or somewhat of an apology, that they released this past week. We're going to start that episode right now. How's it going, everybody? It's a great day on the internet. Welcome to Assemble. I'm Matt. Thank you guys so much for joining us here. We are going to talk a little bit more about Cyberpunk. So we had Cyberpunk's co-founder, one of the co-founders, have an apology statement that came out recently. But before we get into that, I want to be able to talk to you guys about this most recent news that came out from a Jason Schreier article, where Jason actually had an interview and he was speaking to an unnamed dev that worked on Cyberpunk that was talking about the development cycle and their thoughts on when this game would have actually been ready to launch to the mass public. It's kind of interesting, so let's go. So at E3 in June 2019, CD Red announced that the game would come out on April 16th, 2020. This date itself, and based on the article itself too, they're saying how this timeline was basically a joke across the developers for the game, that they didn't think it was going to be anywhere near ready for that time frame. What gets really interesting with that whole timeline, guys, is just how CD Red was really sure of themselves, or at least presenting that the game was going to be ready for console releases. And at the time, and we've talked about this before, but at the time, they didn't know what the PS5 or the Series X was going to even look like in terms of its architecture. So they weren't preparing, or seemed to be preparing, for the next gen consoles. They were making this game presumably for the PS4 and the Xbox One, as well as PC. But saying that this was going to be ready in April, obviously it wasn't, that we got so many more and more delays for the game. It's pretty wild overall. So in the article, they actually write this. One person said they thought that the date was a joke. Based on the team's progress, they expected the game to be ready in 2022. Developers created memes about the game getting delayed, making bets on when it would actually happen. So this is the big takeaway, is that even internally, the developers themselves were sitting there thinking that this game wouldn't even be ready for launch, mass launch, until 2022. Which, what do you guys think? If the game was going to come out for its original slotted release window of 2022, and we didn't have any of this that we've experienced with Cyberpunk, would you have been okay with that? If there was no initial kind of release date of back at E3 saying that this thing was going to be ready in April of 2020, would you guys have been okay with a 2022 release date, or would it have been so far into the future that you wouldn't have even cared? It seems to be that with the story of Cyberpunk, that you just keep pulling layers back more, and you peel this onion, and just more and more seems to be happening with this story as it continues to unfold. It's pretty astounding that they try to push this whole thing through. And then, given that they made that apology speech where for 5 minutes they were talking about how they didn't want to place any blame on, the developers for this, that this was basically coming from leadership and the investors, major stakeholders, that they are the ones that actually push this thing out. I just don't get why overall you would just push push the product when it is just nowhere near completion, even on its core PC. And the thing is that it also contradicts what a lot of was being said by CD Red's leadership team leading up to the launch in that entire year, where we kept seeing and hearing things that it looks great, or it's running great on PC, it's running well on PS4 and Xbox One. So they had been testing this, presumably, unless they're lying, but they kept talking about how this thing is doing well, and we're happy with it, and how happy with its performance. Meanwhile, the developers themselves seem to be on the other camp where, nothing seemed ready, and they were arguing that it's just not ready at all for launch for this past year. Now, giving that apology speech where they're standing on stage and they've got the big Cyberpunk logo behind them, it felt very corporate, and it felt, in my opinion, it felt very kind of just forced, and it felt like it was a message given to the stakeholders, the shareholders, the investors, that they had to do that, and not to just kind of ease the fire and ease the tension, because the stock went down initially after the game had released. It's starting to pick back up as well. So on the business side, you can see why the investors would be so upset that this game didn't launch, it's not performing, and there's a ton of backlash for it. It just all felt very fabricated, and I appreciate that the messaging was that, we don't want to place any blame on the developers, it wasn't their fault, we, the leadership team, tried to push this thing out too quickly. But this message is coming out, you know, like a long way out after the release and after we've all gone through the experience of Cyberpunk and the issues with, you know, lack of patches and the game not performing well on any system and unplayable for the like majority of the time. It's unplayable on PS4 and Xbox One. I just found it a very interesting time. Like, I found a very interesting time period for them to come out and make the apology and make the statement now that we've had the game. The game has been out, people have beaten the game, and on PC, some people have had a very good experience to relatively okay experience. And then the last gen, like we've had refunds, we've had Sony shut the game down on their store, and all of that has already happened. And now we are getting an apology about the game. It just feels a little bit kind of and a little bit empty, in my opinion, of you coming out now to announce this thing. Now, along with that, guys, we also got the announcement within that whole thing about CDPR's roadmap and what it looks like for their whole patch and update to get this thing out. And what kind of puts a whole bow on this thing, it's kind of almost funny, is that they're looking at a 2022 completion date. So I think, I'm just taking a shot here, I think that everyone just experienced the beta. I think that's what they pushed out to everybody, and obviously it was nowhere near ready. But with this roadmap that we're seeing, clearly they're looking at a 2022 completion date where we have initial patches that are coming out now that are going to be rolled out over the next year. Where like in 2021, they're, you know, they talk about how they're gonna have patch 1.1 and 1.2, and then there's this giant gap. Then there's this middle section where they're going to be doing updates and fixes. And that's where it's kind of troubling to me, is that you're going to see, like, you know, free DLC and all these free updates and all these patches, but there is this wide amount of time where they're just going to be continuously trying to fix the game so that they can hit this benchmark of 2022. And I think that it all kind of comes back to the fact that this game was originally slotted for 2022 for the developers to be done at that time, but the shareholders and investors and everybody at the top wanted to get this thing out and get it out there across all of the consoles and to hit that new wave of new consoles. And realistically, and you guys tell me what you think, but like, I feel like, why wouldn't you just hold off until 2022, other than the financial piece? But you've tarnished a reputation and you've lost so much money because of all the refunds. Why not hold off until 2022? And why not say that maybe in the meantime, maybe it does become ready in 2020 for PC, and they only launch it on PC, and then just say, hey, this is going to be a next gen title. This is going to be a next generation game, 2022, for PS5 and Series X. And then PC owners would still get some updates and patches, but they would see that the game is working well. You get a lot more good fanfare there on the PC side. And then you're going to see, you would probably see that audience turn around and say, man, can't wait for this thing to come to PS5, and then all of the console owners can experience this game that's had a ton of love and fanfare and appreciation for. But instead, they try to rush this thing out on consoles that couldn't handle the game, and now we see the end result. It's really a shame. I think the game, for a lot of people in the community, have had a good experience when they played on PC, and unfortunately have had a terrible experience or bad experience to okay experience on their consoles, unless they're on last gen. It's really too bad because the developers are not at fault. They wanted to put out a good product. They've had this thing going for many years, but it's unfortunate that it's kind of come down to all of this. 2022 is when this game is going to be done. What do you guys think of all of this news, of the apology speech, as well as the update and the little bit of tidbit news that we got that, you know, the game was supposed to be slotted for 2022? And where do you stand with Cyberpunk right now? Did you play it? Did you beat it? Did you refund it? Let me know where you're at with this whole game. Guys, thank you so much for watching this quick little news update on Cyberpunk 2077 and how it should have been in 2022. Stay tuned for more content every single week here on Assemble. I'm Matt. Thank you as always for assembling with us. See ya.